Good afternoon and welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. I am thrilled that you all are here for our chat today. Joining me is Professor Robert Tsai. He is a professor of law at American University's Washington College of Law. And Robert, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be with you, Kristan.
So we are talking about today what's in a name and analyzing or discussing some of the social and legal implications around specifically referencing the COVID-19 virus as the China virus, but also sort of seeing how that plays out in history and what we might be in for going forward. So speaking of history, when you and I were chatting initially, we had talked about how this is certainly not the first time that something like this has had an effect in the United States. And we were specifically talking about when the Bubonic Plague came to Honolulu at the turn of the century, turn of the last century. And so why don't we start there in terms of a history lesson?
Sure. I think that, America's past experiences with pandemics and with disease certainly offer us things to remember, to think about in terms of how we have responded to them in the past, and hopefully we've learned some lessons. In terms of what happened in Honolulu, about 1899, I think it was in December, there were a couple of Chinese migrants who had gotten sick. And not only did they get very sick, but they ended up dying. They clearly had signs of being infected with the bubonic plague. But the fact that the first few victims in Honolulu were Chinese ended up reinforcing a number of sort of pernicious stereotypes that many people may have had about disease. For one thing, a lot of white citizens believed that somehow if you had European blood, you were somehow more immune to these kinds of diseases. And so, the fact again that a number of people of color were the first victims ended up reinforcing this sort of pseudo scientific notion of a connection between race and disease, at least communicable diseases. And what happens, of course, in Honolulu is that eventually, and things happen so quickly, but the politicians in charge kind of give way to this sense that we've got to do something about the Chinese, who are assumed to be the primary carriers of the disease. And of course, we know now this is not right. But what happens is they first quarantine Chinatown, and there are armed people out there kind of cordoning off this part of the town. And then they do a couple of controlled burns. They're burning buildings where the people were sick. They take all their belongings, they throw them in a giant pile in the street. Their belongings are to be burned. People are being kind of herded off temporarily. And there's also these sort of public places where they have to shower. And then, of course, what happens next is this sort of utter devastation, is that the fires get out of control. And then
thank you everyone for your patience. At some point, I think I'm just going to have to wire myself into the modem. But Professor Tsai, where we were, I think where we dropped was just getting into the cautionary tales that you were explaining. So why don't we pick up there?
Sure, absolutely. We were talking a little bit about what happened in Honolulu when the first Chinese people became ill from the bubonic plague. And we were talking about the controlled burns, what they thought were controlled burns as a way of sanitizing buildings and possessions. And of course, that gets out of control, and thousands of people are displaced. I think one of the lessons that we might be able to draw from that episode is just that we have to be very careful about the way we talk about disease in a time of crisis, at a time when people's emotions are so high. And in Hawaii, when public officials and political leaders took actions that reinforced this pernicious stereotype that Chinese people were the primary carriers of disease, This meant also then that they administered policies that forced the Chinese population to kind of bear in an unequal way the burdens of having to confront this disease. And there's a whole bunch of things that's wrong with this, right? That, as we know from the standpoint of public health, communicable diseases don't discriminate on the basis of race in that way, right?
Right.
They spread the way they spread. And once we learn how diseases spread, that ought to be the focus. And so when public officials sort of ratify these sort of pernicious stereotypes that are running around about a connection between race and disease, it can distract us from how to really get at the problem.
No, absolutely. And this was a part of history I really knew nothing about prior to our conversation a week or so ago. And so just doing the research on it was really fascinating about certainly the disproportionate burden on was, I think in the particular area that they had done the control burns were largely Chinese, Japanese, and Native Hawaiian population. And so just to have a sense of that, that burden, I suppose you can make some allowances for less was known about how diseases were transmitted and things like that. And so some of that fear and that lack of ability to identify is understandable. But also, the thought that it wouldn't have spread beyond that, but for the immigrants or those particular populations moving about the city, I just found really interesting.
Absolutely, and we can think of other moments too where something similar like that has happened. And again, sticking with the bubonic plague, and in 1924, it makes its way to Los Angeles. Most people think either through San Francisco or perhaps from ships that dock in LA. But once again, we see, like in Honolulu, the first few people, and here their entire families who become ill and die are of Mexican ancestry. And so, again, a kind of negative lesson is that public health officials quarantine the Mexican families and the Mexican neighborhood, and they end up sort of confirming this mistaken assumption that foreigners are the primary carriers of the disease.
So you were talking about how the bubonic plague, we're still continuing on in that vein, and then it comes to mainland U.S. So LA and San Francisco. Let's sort of how some of those same challenges were coming up.
Right. So when the bubonic plague shows up in Los Angeles, once again, the first few victims, and this time their whole families are people of color. They're people of Mexican heritage, and the first steps that public health officials take in Los Angeles is to quarantine those homes and those neighborhoods. It's only later, once the city undertakes a more systematic effort to hunt rats and to test and exterminate rats, that they discover that there are infected rats, all throughout Los Angeles, not just in the poorer immigrant communities, but also in Beverly Hills, the wealthier communities. And that's kind of a lesson to us, right? That it might be tempting on the part of some to kind of buy into this notion that somehow there's a deep connection between disease and foreignness, or disease and race. But in fact, if we listen to public health officials, and if we listen to the historians of disease, we will learn that often with communicable diseases, right, these kinds of assumptions steer us in the wrong direction.
Yep. And so we've been seeing some in the news recently, to bring us fully up to the present, of anecdotally and in news reports of people who are of Asian descent, whether they be Asian Americans or Asians living here in the United States, having interactions with various members of the public that indicate that there is some fear, it seems, just based on race in this instance. I was listening to one of the Daily's podcasts from, I think it was last week, where one of the reporters was explaining how someone in her neighborhood had walked past her and basically said, I thought that we just, what we just did meant that you would have to leave. And experiencing, having those conversations, I feel like a lot of people are probably fairly isolated from that. But wasn't sure if there are any particular news stories that have stood out to you about how this fear is pervading, or if you have anything personal that you wanted to share about that as well.
Kristan, it is something that I've been keeping one eye on. We know that with the kind of ramping up of rhetoric, in some quarters, there's been an effort to just call it the China virus. I know that there's been a little bit of a backing off on the part of our national leadership, kind of bowing to public officials who have said that labeling disease, labeling viruses by understood, place of origin can worsen some of these kinds of things, whether xenophobia, racism, or just distracting us from what we really need to keep kind of foremost in our minds in terms of kind of getting a handle on the disease. I have kept an eye on this, I mean, I don't take my own children, even though I have teenagers, when I go out to the store with me. A little bit is because I don't want them to be unnecessarily exposed to, to those prejudiced views. And I remember I was at Whole Foods the other day, doing one of these huge runs on food, and I had a mask on, I had a hat on, and as I'm going down the aisle of Whole Foods, there was a woman kind of coming up the other direction, and her eyes kind of widened, and she kind of like leaped to the side into the food to her right as I passed, and she didn't say anything, and but it crossed my mind. I wondered whether this was part of the reaction, but I do know that other people have experienced far worse than what I just described. There was a report in New York where an Asian person was on a bus, and several people started attacking the individual and saying you're responsible for the China virus, and others have been told go back to where you came from, bring the disease with you, this kind of stuff. And so I have noticed that activists who pay attention to this stuff, and even the FBI has said that we all need to be a little bit more careful in the way we interact, and also be watchful for the harassment that can come with these prejudice ideas about disease, kind of getting us to lose our control, I suppose.
Yep. Well, as you and I were talking, there certainly are a lot of examples of diseases being named after places of origin. So you have the Spanish flu, which has been in the news a lot, just in terms of how people are managing the reopening, and perhaps some cautionary tales. The Zika virus, technically named after a place of origin, the river there. Same sort of with MERS. And so, there's certainly that initial, I think, familiarity with naming something after the place of origin. But then when you take a deeper look at some of those, you also find that those origins aren't necessarily correct. And so, and I think that's where we get into some of the challenges of, while we understand the initial impulse, especially given how many things need names these days, to name it after sort of where it first was noticed, that does place a stigma on that particular locale or location, and as history shows, oftentimes unfairly. And so that just is part of what plays into this as well, and why trying to change it to let's not name it after a place. That's why this is called COVID-19.
Right. I think it's, it's very easy to say, oh, who cares? There are a lot of things that we've named by a point of origin, and you're right. Certainly, we've been wrong about that, and it's a very tricky enterprise to identify a single origin of for any disease. But I think that we've got to ask ourselves why do we need to talk about disease in that way? Certainly from the scientific perspective, it's hard to understand what's gained from that. As you point out, you can be wrong about the origin. Knowing a particular place where it came from may not necessarily help us actually fight the disease in the first place. Knowing places where there have been outbreaks helps us, because we can go to those places. We can talk to the people who have dealt with it. We can test, and we can trace, right, people who've been infected. All of those things are help from that standpoint, but we don't need to know, or we don't need to call something, China virus or Spanish flu in order to do those kinds of things. And I think that from the other perspective, what we've got to ask also is why are the people who are insisting on calling something by a place, why are they doing that? We should ask ourselves, what motivations, what agenda they may be pursuing when they insist, for example, on calling COVID-19 China flu, right? And I think when we ask those deeper questions, we will see that oftentimes it's not an innocuous thing, and it's not necessarily a scientifically accurate thing, but rather it is something about political mobilization. It is that move is probably deeply connected to trying to blame someone or some entity for what we're experiencing here. And part of that is politics, of course, right? That we look for enemies and we look for friends and so forth. But we have to understand that if that's really what's going on, then we don't necessarily want to be kind of confident participants in some of the downsides of of this goal, let's say, of making China the primary enemy, or the WHO like the political enemy of the United States. So I think a lot of that is what's going on in terms of driving efforts to name this as China flu.
That makes sense. And this wouldn't be a Jackson Center broadcast if I didn't bring Justice Jackson in at some point. And so this seems like a good place to do that. And when I was initially reading these stories, the correlation to Jackson's descent in Korematsu sort of naturally sprung to mind about how people were being treated differently simply on basis of race, ethnic origin. And when you and I were chatting, we talked about the loaded weapon language. And this sort of feels like a good segue into that, how choosing to name something in this way is kind of like a loaded weapon. Yeah.
I think that's right. I mean, Justice Jackson, of course, although he went along with the court's upholding of a race-based and nationality-based curfew when it came to the Japanese Americans, when it came to the question of kind of rounding up Japanese Americans and then detaining them during World War II, he definitely dissented, as you say. I think there's two things that are really valuable and interesting, things that we ought to think about when it comes to his dissent in that case. And certainly one of the things is what you pointed out, is that when and he's talking primarily about judges there, but I think we can expand the lesson to encompass, other public officials. This is a lesson that, people who are in charge in an emergency, I think, really ought to reread this part of Justice Jackson's discussion about race and talking about race and dealing with race in an emergency, because you're absolutely right. He says that we ought to be worried when people who are in charge validate this idea of racial discrimination, right? That there is there's a racial basis for something, either as a cause of danger, or maybe in our case of disease, this idea then, this racialization, right, of something then kind of lies around as a loaded weapon, kind of for anybody to pick up in an emergency. And that's absolutely right. That's something that we need to think about as we deal, think about how to deal with the crisis. But the other thing also, there's another part of his opinion just a little bit earlier, which is great. He also says that guilt is personal and not heritable. And, and throughout American history, there has been this temptation from time to time, to think that certain kinds of attributes are in fact passed on, right? At one point it was criminality, and other times, and there is some basis for the idea that certain kinds of diseases obviously can be passed on, but when it comes to communicable things, right, we're in a very different sort of ball of wax. But those two ideas are really, I think, pretty thoughtful on the part of Justice Jackson. And we might say that one of the things he's saying is that we ought to be careful as public officials in not ratifying, not validating pernicious stereotypes or racist ways of thinking, because these kinds of things can cause great harms, right? They can cause us to administer policies in an emergency that force one group of Americans, one group of people, just a part of the community, to shoulder the burdens, right, of what's going on. And this can distract us, particularly when it comes to disease, because we might be so distracted that we allow the disease to ravage other aspects of the community while we're sort of exclusively focused on just one aspect of the community.
Right, or miss the signs of the spread or something along that line because we're so focused on one area.
Absolutely.
Right. Yep. Well, and I also, hat tip to you. I encourage everybody to read Justice Jackson all the time. So the fact that you also made that plug, I appreciate. So thank you.
My pleasure.
And we had also talked about, and you had mentioned just a few moments ago, thinking through in a deeper way, perhaps what is the motivation behind naming something in a particular way? And we have certainly seen some, I would say we've started to see some news stories on this as well. But I like for these chats to try and be as practical as possible as well. So what are some of the things that consumers of news should be thinking about and should be paying attention to when they are reading these types of stories?
Well, certainly, I think that the first thing we should ask ourselves is, again, if someone's talking in a racialized way about a communicable disease, we should ask us why. Is there any actual science connected to what they're saying? If there isn't, and a lot of the rhetoric that we've been hearing, trying to push this phrase, China flu, is not connected to the kind of public health goals of getting widespread buy-in. I mean, one of the things that you can, you hear that phrase enough, someone might say, "Oh, well, look, we don't have any Chinese people or very many Chinese people in my neighborhood." I moved out to this area, and I don't have a lot of foreigners or people of color in my neighborhood, so I got nothing to worry about. And this would be a completely kind of terrible letting of one's guard down when it comes to communicable disease, right? Because what we know about COVID-19 is just how easily it can spread from person to person, and even from from objects where the virus is still alive. And so we can kind of lull ourselves into a sense of, we need to be careful of certain kinds of people, and I'm not actually seeing those kinds of people, and so I've got nothing to worry about. So back to your question of what should we be asking ourselves? Again, I think we should centrally ask ourselves, why are people using racialized language to talk about COVID-19, and then eventually we should ask ourselves sort of, what does the person who's talking that way, what do they stand to gain from talking that way? And so some of the people talking that way are politicians who are obviously trying to get reelected, or they're, as we know, elected officials try to curry favor with certain other elected officials who might be talking the same way. And so it may be that certain political fortunes are connected in the same way. I saw that the other day, I guess it was yesterday or the day before, when President Trump decided to seize on the pandemic, to say that he was going to issue an executive order suspending all immigration to the United States. Now, historians of immigration and legal theorists like me know that this is a pretty dramatic unilateral exercise of authority, one that a lot of people think is inconsistent with our immigration laws as Congress has enacted them, and so forth. But some of the people who are kind of promoting the president's kind of decisive action said things like this, right? Hey, I support this because we're really doing something about China flu. And, Tom Cotton made such a quote, said such a thing. And these kinds of things are very deliberate. And I think that one of the reasons why he might be saying this is that, he is trying to mobilize his constituents to think about the disease in a certain way, to think about the president's actions and style of leadership in a certain way. And a lot of this is wrapped up with, of course, our current president's election as kind of part of a nationalist movement. And he rode this sort of nationalist wave to office. And so, that order, the way of talking about our current pandemic, can't be seen as entirely separate from some of these political goals when we hear that language, right? And so we should be reminded that some elected officials have talked this way about other kinds of problems. Talking about China, for example, being responsible for potentially some economic problems in the United States. So this is very much a kind of nationalist answer, a kind of identification of a foreign population or perhaps a foreign government as being responsible for a problem that I think will help us understand where some of this rhetoric is coming from.
Yep, and to take us out of sort of the disease realm for a moment, you and I had also discussed that the responsibility to be careful of language is universal, and that there is also a Biden promotion out there that is not as careful with language as it should be as well. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess earlier in the week, or maybe it was end of last week, an ad that looks like it was generated by the Biden campaign went viral. I saw it on Twitter, and had a lot of this ominous music, and in it, the Biden campaign was hitting President pretty hard for what they said was his kind of lack of preparation, but they used a lot of this language about China, about the Chinese, and I think that the way that they put the ad together was not very careful in terms of distinguishing between, say, the country of China or the Communist Party in control of China from, say, Chinese people, people who happen to be born Chinese of Chinese parents, which include a number of people in the United States, and so there are people who saw that ad who really worried that the Biden campaign was falling into the same trap of both capitalizing on kind of anti-Chinese sentiment that might be already out there in the United States surrounding the disease, but then kind of also falling prey to this strategy of kind of mobilizing fear around COVID, but reinforcing the sense that Chinese people are somehow broadly responsible for the disease. And so, I think that having seen the ad, those criticisms are, at least some of those criticisms, really are well taken.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so we started to talk a little bit about the immigration ban as well. So I believe the wording of it is that there is a 60-day ban on immigration from whenever that is signed. The rationale given that there are now so many United States citizens who are out of work, that this gives them the opportunity to be first in line, I suppose, when businesses start rehiring. That certainly sounds like a valid reason for something like this. As you mentioned, it is certainly very pro-America, pro-American citizen. But there are a number of exceptions in the immigration ban as well that seem to indicate that while that is the proffered rationale, that there are potentially ulterior things underneath it.
Yeah, it's the pause on immigration across the board that was announced the other day. The order itself is not as broad as President Trump's initial tweet in the middle of the night. As you point out, there's a bunch of carve outs and so forth, and there's clearly a fight within the administration about how far he should go and maybe how much he can get away with during the current pandemic. But it's clear that some members of the president's staff think this is the right time to push kind of an emergency-based, maybe even a COVID-19 rationalized end or pause to immigration. One thing to keep in mind, though, of course, is that there are a bunch of other pauses as well, right? The Muslim ban that President Trump campaigned on. The first executive order he signed when he got into office, that was formally billed as a pause as well, but it's still now almost 4 years in duration, is kind of an indefinite ban in reality. But in terms of what's going on, he's the administration is clearly trying to take advantage of concern or outsized concern about outsiders as possible sources of disease to push an agenda item that has long been part of a kind of grassroots part of his movement, and that is that there's a part of Trumpism that has long been about not only ending illegal immigration, doing something about that, but actually kind of curbing legal immigration. So Stephen Miller, of course, is one of his close advisors, become closer as others have left the administration. And Miller, of course, was mentored by, I've now dropped his name, Jeff Sessions, right, of Alabama. And they and others have long sort of opposed the Immigration Naturalization Act of 1965. They point to that law, that moment, as a moment that diversified America in ways that changed America, and they don't think for the better. So that's part of the you want to call it ethno-national aspect of the movement, or at least a strong restrictionist aspect of the movement. And they've long wanted to end immigration or radically change, kind of dial it back. So I think what we got to ask ourselves in terms of this pause is whether it really has anything to do with disease at all. Because if that's a justification, it seems like not necessarily a satisfactory answer to stopping disease, because it's not just immigrants, obviously, that are spreading disease. It's anyone who might be traveling anywhere. And so unless you're going to get serious about people from everywhere traveling, in other words, right, COVID-19 isn't distinguishing between people who are coming here who want to become citizens, right? And people are coming here for vacation. And if that's, given that scientific point, then it's hard to imagine how a pause in immigration will do much to solve our current pandemic. So it's not a very good solution from that sort of scientific perspective.
And
So
it also completely doesn't address internal movement as well. So, if it's someone going from New York to LA could potentially be taking it with them, and there's nothing addressing that yet.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I'm glad you brought that up because in a way, the administration did make some noises a few weeks back about possibly exercising some of its power that it has under federal law to, maybe have a quarantine or a stopping point between states, let's say between two hotspots or something, or a hotspot in a place where we haven't seen a lot of infection. And they could certainly do that, but then they backed off from that. It's a little bit telling that, now we see this rolled out in an area where the president does generally have more power. But it's also an area in a way that's a little easier to kind of do and then kind of declare victory, right? Oh, look, I've sort of done something here about the disease when we've got to wonder whether it has any effect.
Right. And something else you and I had talked about, although the media reports have largely been focused on the impact of the China virus on Asian Americans and Asians in the country, what we haven't really talked about yet, but seems about ripe for discussion, is how potentially white nationalist movements might be able to glom onto this and use it for their purposes as well.
I think this is something that we need to think a little bit about, as you say. One of the things that Justice Jackson did worry about, having lived through a World War II and seen the rise of fascist movements, as well as totalitarian movements on the left, he very much worried about how movements use language, how movements take advantage of crises to destabilize, liberal forms of government, and I think that in terms of white nationalism, in terms of separatist movements, in terms of the militia movements in the United States, we face that sort of a risk today. And in terms of the disease, there are a lot of groups that are just sort of waiting for America to fall apart, who are kind of cheering a lot of the things that we've been talking about. They're cheering the fact that there are people of color or foreigners that are being identified as so-called culprits of disease. They are cheered by violence that they see sometimes being aimed at Chinese people, and a lot of them are on the active on social media, internet, and so forth, just kind of stoking this kind of racial division, racial suspicion, conspiracy theories broadly, right? About the WHO, about China, about maybe Chinese people and Jewish people being responsible, having some advantage in Americans getting sick. So it's definitely something we need to worry about and keep an eye out for. And I guess having done a little bit of that work, one thing we want to be aware of as people who want to resist those kinds of movements and that kind of thinking is that what those folks are hoping for is a set of conditions, cultural conditions and political conditions, where a broader swath of Americans will be more receptive to authoritarian forms of government, crackdowns on people who don't look like the average white American. Those they want that more receptive mindset, and that's a lot of the ball game right now. And so we need to be thinking about not participating in creating those kinds of conditions where more people will be open to white nationalist or separatist ideologies.
Yep, but, I think that circles back around nicely to your thought or your comment on analyzing what the motivation may be behind using some of this language. Why don't we open it up to questions? This is usually to give people a little chance to formulate their questions and type them. This is usually when I ask people, what are they drinking? And so for part of our tea time, what is in your mug?
I am right now drinking Earl Grey tea. I've had my fill of matcha today, so this is what I've moved on to.
Very nice. Yes, I went with again matcha myself. There's just something about the popcorn tea that I really like, and so I like the nuttiness of it. I did try some whipped matcha this weekend, which was an interesting experiment. I can't say it was fully successful, but but I enjoyed trying it. So
I'll take your word for that.
Yeah. Well, it was sort of going off I don't know if you've seen the pictures of the DeLonga coffee. So that sort of whipped coffee. And someone had made a matcha version as well. And since I tend to prefer tea to coffee, I was like, okay, let's see if I can try that out. So it definitely got a little whipped, but I don't think it was quite as smooth as it was supposed to be.
Huh. So. Frothy tea, that would be new for me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yep. It's like bubble tea, but thicker.
Bubble tea is good, except that, too much of that and I get bloated.
It's all the tapioca.
Exactly.
All right. I am not seeing any questions at the moment. So I guess, Robert, I would say in terms of parting words, what would you like to leave our audience with? What are you hoping that they're thinking about now? Yeah, let's start with that.
Sure. I mean, I think that what I would leave people with is just that we do a lot with language. Language is, right, the primary instrument that human beings, we as citizens use to not just communicate ideas, but actually get things done. And so keeping that in mind will help us really, I think, understand some of the risks involved when we use racialized language to talk about social problems. It's not just that it can lead to a small part of the community being forced to bear all the harms that come with a problem, but it's also that it can create kind of symbolic conditions of inequality. In other words, you referred to stigma before, and those of us who study inequality really take this seriously, that there are many different ways in which fellow citizens, the state, in a variety of ways can stigmatize certain aspects of this population. To tell you that you are, if you belong to that part of the population, less worthy of respect, not deserving of being here among us, perhaps not entitled to the same kind of rights and protections that other parts of the community get, and so language does a lot of this, right? Language tells us who we are as individuals. It tells us what kind of community we aspire to be, and I think this is a set of concerns that carries through whether we're talking about wartime measures, as Justice Jackson was concerned with, or we're talking about how to deal with a communicable disease as we're currently dealing with.
All right, we did get a question in from Chris, and I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. So because things like the pandemic obviously don't observe borders, as far as germs are concerned, borders don't exist. Is there a benefit, I guess, in contemplating a world without borders? We talk a lot, and Justice Jackson certainly cognizant of sovereign immunity. And, one of the biggest challenges with negotiating the London Charter and Agreement and the principles of the Nuremberg trials had to result in, at what point does somebody else get to intervene in a domestic issue? And so, would you ever contemplate a time when borders didn't exist? That, something might drive us towards in terms of equality, that sort of monumental shift.
Well, certainly there's a school of thought that our notions of equality aren't just ideas that are nationalistic in nature. In other words, America has its understanding of equality. France has its own set of equality ideas, but rather that the notion of equality is one that we're born with. It's a universal idea. It's one that has some basic fundamental, kind of fundamentally shared notions, regardless of where you happen to be born or where you happen to be living.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is, there's great value in thinking of some, some basic notion of equality in that way. Some philosophers talk about it as basic equality. That's a phrase that's often used to talk about it in those terms. The question raises something else, which is that it's possible that dealing with a worldwide crisis of this sort might cause us to think about fundamental reforms. And a lot of things that have been in public debate recently about things like whether it's a good idea to have healthcare be so closely tethered to jobs, because in a crisis like this, everybody's losing their jobs, and of course many of them, those jobs won't come back. But it might be that, as the questioner is maybe implying, that even broader structural reforms are under consideration. I'm reminded of this moment after the end of World War II. You mentioned Justice Jackson, of course, and his role in pushing international law, particularly international human rights law. But there is this moment where not just Justice Jackson, but a lot of people were broadly worried about nuclear devastation and the destruction that comes from world wars. And there was a global movement to think of one world government. And a lot of different groups around the world actually wrote plans and wrote constitutions. I wrote a little bit about this in my second book about this. And that was actually one of those moments where people wanted a form of government, a set of rights that was powerful enough to deal with the problems that we could foresee in the future.
Yeah, great. Thank you. All right. I think those are all of our questions for today. Robert, I'd like to thank you so much for joining me for tea today. I appreciate it. And this was a really interesting conversation for me.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
Of course. And then for those of you for next week is actually an important anniversary for Justice Jackson. May 2nd is the date he was officially nominated or officially appointed as the chief U.S. prosecutor for Nuremberg. So next week for tea, we will be talking about that. And I will be joined by a special guest from the Truman Presidential Library, Dr. Kurt Graham. So looking forward to that. Thank you all so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you next week.